I'm Andrew Sorkin of the New York Times, and thank you for joining us for this final conversation of the DealBook DC Policy Project. It's a privilege for us to have this evening with us Senator Mitt Romney. We've had a number of conversations over this past few days dealing with difficult policy challenges that we're all grappling with. But one of the things we need more than ever is to find some common ground. And if there's somebody who's trying to find common ground in Washington, it is Senator Romney. Somebody who has tried to cross the aisle many a time, and we appreciate him joining us this evening. Senator, thank you.
Thank you. Happy to join you, Andrew.
It's great to see you. There's so much to talk about, including news that you've made today around issues around the minimum wage and so much more, even in the past couple of weeks, different initiatives that you've endeavored upon. But I want to start, if we could, thinking about the stimulus, because all of the things that I think that you've been thinking about embedded in it is the big stimulus plan. And I know you spent some time with President Biden in recent weeks talking about the stimulus plan. I know you object to it. I'm hoping you could help us understand the way you think about it and what you have told him and what's happening now behind the scenes.
Well, not a lot is happening behind the scenes that involves Republicans, because I think the Democratic leadership has determined that they want to push through the plan without any changes to it whatsoever and without any input from Republicans. And because it'll be done through budget reconciliation, they don't need any of our votes. So I think that's their intent. We went with the proposal of $618 billion. We indicated also we're happy to compromise, to meet in the middle, to work together. But the administration had no interest really in pursuing that path. And the Democratic leadership in the Senate and the House has not picked up that path either. Yeah, I find it a very troublesome bill, not so much because of the price tag, which is pretty substantial, but because there's a lot of stuff in there that's just simply wasteful. And I wish we could use the money that we're going to go out and borrow from China to actually do things that'll make a difference. I mean, so for instance, there's $350 billion slated to go to states. Now, most of our states didn't have a bad couple of years. Most of our states are doing very well. 21 states actually had their revenues go up during COVID. So sending money to states that don't need it doesn't make a lot of sense. California has record surplus, for instance, but it's slated to get $27 billion in borrowed money from the federal government. That just doesn't make sense.
When you raised that with the president, what did he tell you?
Well, you know, I brought in a big map of the United States, and I had a color code for the economic conditions of each state, who had surpluses, who instead had a deficit, and said we don't need to give money to all the states that had surpluses. And he didn't have a response to that. He found my chart, I hope, interesting, and he and the vice president looked at it. But I pointed out that we're sending money to a bunch of states that don't need it. And that there are much higher priorities. There are people who really need the funds. There are small businesses that need the funds. We could be spending some money, by the way, on climate change technology. We could be spending the money in infrastructure. But to send money to places that don't need it is really not great policy.
Let me ask you a political question. President Biden has talked about being a negotiator, and I think there was an argument that he was going to try to negotiate with you. You're now saying he's not. Is that a mistake politically in your mind?
I do think it's a mistake politically. I think it will lead to more resistance on the part of my colleagues to open up negotiations with the administration. But I think they looked and they saw that they can do a lot of things without any Republican votes at all and call them budget reconciliation. And if the parliamentarian agrees that it's primarily a budget provision, why, they don't need us. And you know, what goes around comes around. We'll be in the majority someday, and we'll probably carry out the same kind of actions that they are, which I think is unfortunate. But then there are a lot of things they can't do unless there are Republican votes. And I'd like to work on those things and actually get something done.
But just in fairness, though, is the gulf just so wide, though, in terms of on this particular bill to get there? And not just with you personally, but with the rest of the party?
Well, there were 10 Republicans. That's what it needed. We had 10 Republicans. And of course, Democrats would line up so we'd have all the votes needed. We came in with our proposal, indicated a willingness to negotiate. We continue to indicate a willingness to negotiate, but there's been no effort to sit down. They haven't called us together to say, hey, let's work this out. And what do you think about this change? They instead are going full blast, light speed, which is we're going through reconciliation. We're going to pass this thing without a single Republican vote.
Okay, so tell me about then this announcement today, a program that you announced with Tom Cotton, a minimum wage. Of course, this stimulus plan is hoping to push through a minimum wage of $15 federally. Your ambition is to do a $10 minimum wage. What's wrong with 15?
Yeah, the worst part of 15 is that it means, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that we'll lose 1.3 million jobs. And the reason for that, of course, is that the minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour. Going to $15 an hour is such a huge leap that a lot of small businesses just won't be able to make it. They won't be able to survive with those kind of numbers. And so they'll go out of business and people will lose their jobs. And so instead moving to $10, and then thereafter, as we propose, moving with inflation, make sure that we get people a living wage, and we do so without costing jobs. The CBO has looked at our provision, doesn't cost any jobs. It instead creates better working conditions for the American worker. And we pair that with provisions to make sure that those that are here illegally can't work and take away jobs from the American worker. So we create a better workforce environment, hopefully leading to even more competition and higher wages going forward.
What do you make of the fact that a lot of Democrats don't believe the CBO score? Meaning they say, we don't believe that 1.4 million people are going to lose their jobs.
Well, my guess is the Democrats are happy to believe it when it tells them something they like, and not so happy to believe it when it tells them something they don't like. But there's no question. I mean, you can just figure this out. If you got a restaurant, for instance, and you have 5 or 6 workers that are getting paid a minimum wage or near minimum wage, and suddenly they're told we're going to double the wages in that restaurant. The restaurant has to either dramatically increase their prices, which of course will mean fewer consumers going there to shop for their meals, or they'll find themselves not being able to make their payments on their rent. I mean, basically businesses go out of business. So for instance, I mean, you could recognize if all of a sudden the minimum wage was $100 an hour, you'd basically close down the economy. Well, going from $7.25 to $15 is going to close down a lot of businesses and cost a lot of jobs. That's pretty straightforward.
What would you think about a targeted minimum wage, targeted directly at based on local marketplaces?
Yeah, well, that's really why states have their own minimum wages in many cases, and that works. If a state wants to go to $15, as I think Washington State has done, fine, and they can look at the experience that they have. But West Virginia, talking to Joe Manchin, he feels the number ought to be more like $10.30 an hour. Given the conditions in his state. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So having the federal minimum wage so high that it's way out of line with what's needed in some parts of our country is obviously destructive to those parts of the country where it does make a lot of sense.
Well, let me ask you a larger, almost philosophical question, because it's something that's come up, I think, in the midst of this pandemic and the stimulus program in particular, which is that a lot of Republicans have said, look, we don't want to take on the debt. There's just too much debt. But at the same time, Democrats say, well, what are you talking about? You voted to pass the Trump tax proposals, which created huge amounts of debt, and then the pandemic came. And so the question is, when is it the right time to take on debt, and when isn't it?
Well, clearly, when there's an emergency like we have with COVID, that's a circumstance where I think the world financial markets that loan money to us say, we understand you're borrowing. And so I don't have a problem with taking on debt to meet our needs. Right now, in our $618 billion proposal, we provided all the money the administration wanted to get vaccines made, distributed, testing equipment, and so forth. So we're there. Likewise, extending unemployment benefits over a long period of time. Yeah, absolutely. Getting schools open. Yes. I mean, these are things you need to do. But sending $27 billion to California when it has a surplus, that doesn't make a lot of sense. The president's plan for $170 billion going to schools, the CBO has looked at that. They said 5% of that will be spent in 2021. 95% will be spent in the out years. That's not COVID relief. That's just doing a favor for the teachers' unions. So there's a lot in the spending that really we should not be doing borrowing for. And if we are going to do borrowing, let's do it for things that actually will have a payback long-term for the American family.
We talked to Janet Yellen yesterday, the Treasury Secretary, and talked about debt and how she thinks about it. And she said that the metric of looking at debt to GDP is actually the wrong metric to consider these days. It's actually just look at the cost of debt unto itself. Do you agree or disagree with her?
Well, I think that's kind of a strange thing to say, in part because when we looked at the countries that got in trouble, the numbers we looked at were debt to GDP, and it's people who loan money that decide what they ought to look at. And clearly, our interest rates are very low right now. But I've been around a while, and interest rates that are low someday become higher. And the average interest rate on federal debt over a long period of time has been much higher than it is now, and it will not always be so low. So if you load up on debt during a time when the interest rates are low, when the interest rates come back to a higher number, they can come back and bite you. When I lost back in 2012, I got a call from Bill Clinton, and he said, Mitt, the interest payments on the debt are going to be $750 billion a year when they return to normal levels. It's like, yeah, that's even more than we spent on our military. So it's not a challenge right now, but I care not just about what it's like for me today, but what it's like for my kids and grandkids over the coming years.
And when you think about the debt, what do you think the upper limit is? And by the way, do you think that it's creating an asset bubble right now? I mean, we're seeing prices in the stock market. We're talking about Bitcoin every day. Do you think they're correlated?
Well, there's no question, but very, very low interest rates create higher asset values, particularly at the high end. Home prices have gone up in part because mortgage rates are so low. I mean, that's one of the things that contributes to that. But what is the right amount of debt? I don't know where that level is. I don't think anyone knows at what point people that loan money to the United States say, I'm concerned about your ability to repay this or to pay the interest. And so I want a little higher interest to take that risk. We've seen that happen in other countries in the world. We know that at some point you've got too much debt. We don't know where that is, but I don't like flirting with going along the edge of a cliff. I want to make sure that we don't borrow more than we need to. And the key thing is this, it's not just borrowing, it's to make sure that you're borrowing for things that actually are needed or will actually have a return for the economy. So infrastructure, investment in technology for global warming. Look, those are things I can get my mind around. But just sending money out to states that don't need it or to schools after they've already reopened, these things just don't make a lot of sense.
Let me ask you about another issue, something that you proposed recently, just in this last month. This is the child benefit plan. This is an allowance effectively for $250 to $350 monthly checks per child. Tell us about your philosophy that undergirds that. How did that come about?
Well, the concern is that we have about 100 different federal programs of getting money to lower income folks to help them with their kids. And that's a good thing to do. It's just very complex. Most of the money comes from the earned income tax credit, a family portion of that, which results in people getting a check at the end of the tax year when they file their taxes. That doesn't really help very much month to month when people are actually having the expenses of having a child. So we said, look, let's take those programs and as they relate to children and family structure, let's consolidate them and have one program that pays families $350 a month per child for up to 3 children until the child turns 6. At 6, the number goes down to $250 a month. And this doesn't discriminate against people whether they're married or not. We don't have a marriage penalty. We get rid of that. It doesn't discriminate against families where, let's say, one parent wants to stay home and raise the kids. We don't think we should force both parents to have to go into the workforce to get benefits. We want to help the kids after all. So we're really concerned about making sure that families that have children have the financial support they need to be able to provide appropriately for those kids, simplify the federal programs, and make sure we remove the marriage penalty and the work penalty that's existed over the years in some of our federal programs.
You mentioned the climate and climate change just a bit earlier. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about over the past 2 days is tax policy and also climate policy, which invariably gets you to the possibility of a carbon tax. I know it's something that you have looked at in the past. Would you be an advocate for it today?
I'm very, very open to a carbon tax, carbon dividend, where there's a tax on oil companies and coal companies and so forth, and that the funds that are raised then go to individual taxpayers so they can meet the cost of the higher price of energy. The reason I'm focused on that as a potential program is because I want to encourage enterprises in America to find ways to do what they're doing using less energy and to have less emissions. I really philosophically am in agreement with what I'm hearing from Bill Gates, who's saying, look, don't play around the edges here. If you want to really deal with global warming, why we're going to have to invest in technology. And he's suggesting a major investment at the federal level in new technology, carbon capture, perhaps nuclear energy, and so forth. Those ideas, I think, make sense to consider. But he also says we need to create incentives for the private sector to really do some investing as well in reducing emissions. And so I'm open to ideas that would make that happen. And the carbon tax, carbon dividend is such an idea which we're evaluating.
There is going to be a fight over another tax, which is a tax reform. I imagine later this year, Treasury Secretary Yellen talked about some of that and what she's anticipating, including the possibility of a conversation around capital gains and what happens to it, carried interest, the step-up basis at death in terms of the estate tax. How do you think that fight's going to go?
Well, I can predict that Republicans are not going to be anxious to see any tax increases. And so I hope as we consider this, we look very carefully at what things will hurt economic growth, because our ability to pay the interest on the debt, our ability to care for our seniors and our kids relates to how well the economy is doing, whether people are able to pay taxes at, at higher wages. So I hope they're very careful to make sure that the elements that they pursue on a entirely partisan basis, that they don't do things that hurt economic growth. And going after the capital gains tax, that's something you got to be careful on. And so going after the corporate tax rate, again, you got to be very careful, because if you raise the capital or the corporate tax rate too high, well, you cause businesses to locate in other countries. You slow economic growth here. It means less job growth. It means lower wages. They got to be really, really careful.
I appreciate all those arguments, but one of the things that I wonder whether you think this is a lesson of the pandemic. One of the things that happened in this pandemic is effectively the government became an insurance policy for everybody, for businesses, for American citizens across the board. And the question is whether taxes, in some respect, whether it's corporate taxes or individual taxes, are effectively the insurance premium that we all have to pay.
Well, ultimately, we're going to have to, pay the interest and ultimately some of the principal on what's being borrowed, and we do that through taxes. There's no question about that. And what we'd like to do is make sure that we don't waste money in such a way that we end up paying with higher taxes to pay for things we wasted money on. And by paying higher taxes, we slow down the economy and make it harder for the American worker. I hope people understand that very simple thing, which is those things we tax, we get less of. Those things we subsidize, we get more of. And so we have to have taxes. And I'm not opposed to recognizing places where there may be a need to raise taxes, but I want to look very carefully to make sure that we're not raising taxes on people who are working class families. And we're also not raising taxes in a way that hurts working class families by killing jobs.
Many years ago, we had a debate, I don't know if you remember this, about carried interest. Do you have a new take on carried interest?
I'm
private equity.
I mean, let a lot of people take a look at that. My own view is if
it's just out of fairness. I know it's not going to raise a lot of money, but it's to me, it's always been one of those things where people could just look at it and say, okay, it's fair.
My point was this, which is if people who are investing in venture capital and so forth, if they're making a capital investment, then it ought to be treated as a capital gain.
Their own money, absolutely.
Yeah. So I would just suggest that if it's instead just free money or money that's like a bonus, that it's going to get taxed as regular income. But where they make an investment, then the return they get on that investment should be taxed at capital gains rates, if there's a special capital gains rate, which I hope there is.
Foreign policy question for you. And today we were watching this hearing around the SolarWinds attack. I wanted to ask about Russia and how you think this administration should shift perhaps its approach towards Russia, and how you think it should be different than the way the Trump administration approached it, and even the way the Obama administration approached it.
Well, I think we recognize that Russia is, in some respects, a very challenged state. Its population is shrinking. Its industrial base is not competitive globally. and they're going to be reaching out, trying to find a way to hang onto a branch before they go over the cliff. And so I suspect more malevolent behavior, and we're going to have to sanction those things pretty aggressively. And I think that in many respects, the best defense is a good offense. When they come after us, as they have through cyber attacks, I think we have to respond in kind, but maybe at 2 or 4 or 10 times greater intensity.
So what does that look like?
Those things will hit back. I'm not talking about doing something of a different character, but if they hit us with cyber, we got to hit them back.
Related to China, it's similar story, which is to say how we should think about the relationship with China. I will mention before we got on, we were talking about the Olympics, and I know you brought the Olympics to Utah. I don't know if you saw this. One of the ranking members of the Homeland Security Committee is now urging Biden to boycott the 2022 Olympics, which are going to be taking place in Beijing over human rights violations and the like. I don't know if you agree with that piece of it, but how do you think about China right now?
Well, China is a competitor, and China does not play by the rules of international trade, and they're killing American jobs and Western jobs. President Trump was right to confront China. He was wrong not to do it in collaboration with our allies around the world and our friends around the world, and even with countries that play by the rules, even though they may not be our closest friends. I think this administration has to work with other nations because we have a lot more clout pushing back on China if we do. With regards to a boycott, I'm happy if President Biden himself boycotts the Olympics in Beijing. I don't want our athletes to suffer. They've planned their whole lives to be ready at this point for this competition. So I don't want to do things that hurt our athletes, but there are a number of things we can do to show our displeasure with China that relate to the Olympics, and that's something which I'm working on with Senator Tim Kaine. We're going to see if we can't find some ways to make our concerns about China very, very clear without punishing our athletes.
What is that? Can you give us a little hint?
Well, there are a number of things that one could consider. One could say we would encourage our citizens not to go as spectators. We could try and frame in some ways the media coverage here in the U.S. of what goes on there, perhaps actually have some coverage of what's being done to the Uyghurs and the people in Hong Kong as part of the broadcasting around the Olympics. There are things one can do in that regard, but actually penalizing our athletes, I think it's kind of an unfair burden for them to have to carry.
Right. I have a couple of personal questions for you before we wrap up, which is, I just want to know what it's been like in Washington for you personally over these past couple of weeks now and months, in terms of your own dialogue and conversation with Republicans, so many of whom didn't vote for impeachment of the president, and what the reaction has been like on just a day-to-day basis.
Well, I must admit, I was a little nervous about what the reaction would be with regards to my vote in the first impeachment trial when I was alone in that vote. And I got a call from Senator John Cornyn the next day, and he said, Mitt, I'm sure you're concerned about how we're all going to react to your vote. He said, I want you to know that I wouldn't want to be part of a group that was critical of someone for voting their conscience. And that's been the attitude of my colleagues. I believe they each voted their conscience as I did. And there's I think a great deal of mutual respect within our caucus and our conference. I think there is among the Democrats as well. I don't want to just say we're the only ones in that regard. It's a good group of people. I'm impressed with the character and the capacity of people. Some really dig in and really get to know an issue. And I have to be honest, it's a privilege to be able to work with them, and I enjoy it.
Let me ask you about this, though, because I was just reading this, that some conservatives have launched a campaign called Recall Romney. And then the chairman of CPAC, where President Trump, the former president, is speaking this weekend, said in a recent interview, I don't know if you saw this, he said that he would actually be afraid for Senator Mitt Romney's physical safety if he were to come to such a meeting. What do you make of that?
I won't be going, in part because I haven't been invited. Although, I did go a number of years, and I was invited. And interestingly, I was cheered by the people there. But I did part with President Trump on a number of fronts and made that clear. And I'm very pleased that my party in Utah came out. They said they didn't agree with what I did, but that they respected the fact that Senator Lee and I voted different ways, but that showed that our party is a big enough tent to accommodate both of us. Look, if we're going to win elections, we have to be able to have people of different points of view that still vote as Republicans and conservatives. And I hope we're able to continue doing that.
I noticed, though, you recently said that Trump was a, quote, unique and capable politician. And I'm curious whether you think he's going to come back, or his family is going to come back, or what the party looks like in the future. Is the Trump name part of it?
Well, populism is successful because it's popular, which is part of its name. And populism hasn't disappeared where it tends to get installed, whether Italy or Argentina or Peru. And so there's a populist movement on the right in our country and on the left. And those movements, I don't believe, are going to be going away anytime soon. Although I think over time, that policies that endure and that really help the American family will be more successful. So I remain, if you will, a more traditional conservative than some of the populist rhetoric within my party. Will President Trump continue to play a role in my party? I'm sure he will. He has by far the largest voice and a big impact in my party. I don't know about his family members, whether they intend to do that, but I expect he will continue playing a role. I don't know if he'll run in 2024 or not, but if he does, I'm pretty sure he will win the nomination.
You think he would win the nomination?
Oh, I think he'd win the nomination if he runs. I mean, a lot can happen between now and 2024. So, and I'm not great at predicting. I subscribe to Yogi Berra's philosophy in that regard. He said, I don't like predicting, particularly if the future's involved. So I don't really know what will happen there, but I look at the polls, and the polls show that among the names being floated as potential contenders in 2024, if you put President Trump in there among Republicans, he wins in a landslide.
Would you campaign against him?
I would not be voting for President Trump again. I haven't voted for him in the past, and I would probably be getting behind somebody who I thought more represented the tiny wing of the Republican Party that I represent. Okay,
final question. Over your shoulder behind you, I noticed this, and I remember reading about this back in 2012, is what I think is your favorite movie. Am I right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay,
yeah,
so
where art thou? It's one of George Clooney's best.
So why? Why is this your favorite movie?
It's hilarious. I mean, it's a Coen Brothers movie, and many of their movies are pretty funny, but this one I think is fantastic. And my family, I have 5 sons. We often are using lines in this film to describe my campaigns because there's a big political component to it as well. It's if you haven't seen it, you got to see it more than once, though. The first time I saw it, it's like, that was an okay movie. It took seeing it several times before I really appreciated the power of the humor.
Senator Mitt Romney, thank you for the conversation. I hope we get to do this several times more, hopefully in person in the future. But thank you so very, very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Andrew. All the best.
Really appreciate it. All the best to you. And all the best to everybody who's been with us these past 2 days. Thank you so very, very much for joining us. We're going to have replays available of all of these conversations on nytimes.com and, of course, in the DealBook newsletter tomorrow morning and throughout the week. So please check it out if you missed any of them. And we thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Thanks.